The small town of Willowbrook was rarely the scene of any excitement. Nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, it was a place where people knew each other's business, where secrets were whispered but rarely scandalous. But that quiet was shattered on a chilly autumn afternoon when news spread through town. Linda Clark was dead. It was Detective Laura Mitchell's first major case since transferring to the Willowbrook Police Department. She stood at the end of a narrow, overgrown path leading to the Clark family's backyard shed, her gaze locked on the structure that seemed to almost sink into the ground, shrouded by a canopy of trees. Yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the wind, casting a sickly shadow over the place where Linda's body had been found just hours before. 21 years old, Laura murmured, flipping through her notes as she surveyed the property. Ethan Clark, quiet kid, kept to himself. No record. Beside her, the coroner gave a low, somber sigh. She had blunt force trauma to the head, Laura. This wasn't an accident. Laura glanced down at the worn photo of Linda Clark in her file. Linda had been in her late 40s, a woman with tired eyes but a warm, kind smile. But Linda's kind smile was gone now, and Laura knew from the rumors floating around town that Linda had struggled for years with bipolar disorder. A loving mother in her better days, she was said to be unpredictable, sometimes even hostile, during her manic episodes. She wondered, not for the first time, how someone with such a profile fit into the violent death scene before her. The Clark house sat at the far end of Willow Lane, an old colonial with peeling paint and a sprawling yard that Ethan had meticulously kept. When Detective Mitchell walked up the steps to the front door, she was greeted by Greg Clark, Linda's husband. His face was drawn and haggard, his hands trembling slightly as he wrung them together. It's just all too much," he stammered, voice cracking. "I don't understand." Linda was doing so much better. She was on her medication, and things were quiet. Laura nodded, sympathetic but unwavering. "We need to talk to Ethan, Mr. Clark. I understand this is difficult, but we have to piece together what happened." Greg nodded, slowly leading Laura through the house. The home was modest, with old wallpaper peeling in corners and floors that creaked under every step. There were family photos on the walls. Ethan as a child, Linda with her arms around him, smiling as though nothing in the world could touch them. But those were only moments, Laura knew. Moments rarely told the whole story. Ethan was waiting for her in the small living room, his tall, lanky frame almost too big for the space. He sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, hands clasped tightly, his expression guarded. His eyes met Laura's, flickering briefly with something she couldn't quite place before settling into a neutral stare. "Ethan," Laura began, taking a seat across from him, "my name is Detective Laura Mitchell. I'm sorry for your loss. I know this must be a terrible shock for you." He nodded, his gaze fixed somewhere over her shoulder. "Thank you," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. Laura leaned forward, her expression gentle but probing. "I want to understand more about your mother's last day. Any details you can remember would help us a lot. Were you here when she was found?" Ethan shook his head slowly, his gaze finally drifting back to her. "I left for work in the afternoon. I didn't know anything had happened until Dad called me, told me to come home right away." His tone was flat, almost robotic, and Laura couldn't help but notice the lack of emotion in his voice. "Where do you work?" she asked, jotting down notes. "At Hardy's Hardware. Been there for a year now," he answered, his voice low. "I was supposed to be there all day, but I did stop by Mrs. Bell's place in the morning. She's a neighbor. Asked me to help her with some gardening work." Laura nodded, making a note to follow up with this neighbor. "And did you speak with your mother before you left?" Ethan's eyes flickered again. "Yeah, I helped her bring in groceries. She was in a good mood, I guess. It's hard to tell sometimes. Did you notice anything unusual? Any sign she might have been upset, or that something was wrong?" He shook his head, almost too quickly. "No, she was just tired, I guess. After we put the groceries away, she sat in the living room reading. And then I left." Laura studied him carefully. Ethan's responses were measured, almost rehearsed, she thought. The more he spoke, the more he seemed to withdraw into himself, each answer delivered with an unnerving calm. Her eyes drifted to his hands, resting on his knees, fingers tightly interlaced. "Ethan, may I ask what happened to your hands?" she asked, gesturing toward the dark red cuts and bruises peeking out from beneath his sleeves. His expression barely changed. "At work, I was moving pallets. Got caught up on some splinters," he replied simply, looking down at his hands with what might have been the faintest flicker of discomfort. "Must have hurt," Laura remarked casually. Ethan shrugged, his face a mask. "Not really. Just stung a bit." Laura took her leave after a few more routine questions, though her mind was spinning with possibilities. As she left, she caught sight of Clara, Ethan's younger sister, peeking around the corner of the staircase. Her eyes were wide and red-rimmed, clearly shaken. "Are you going to find who did this to her?" Clara asked in a small voice, staring up at Laura with something close to desperation. Laura bent down, meeting the girl's gaze directly. "I'll do everything I can, Clara. I promise." But as she walked back to her car, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that the answer might lie closer than anyone wanted to believe. The town of Willowbrook was quiet, yes, but sometimes the darkest secrets hid behind the calmest faces. And she couldn't ignore the unsettling lack of emotion in Ethan's gaze, the mechanical way he recounted his mother's last moments. She sensed something buried there, just beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered. The next steps were clear. She'd have to investigate the neighbor, Mrs. Bell, check Ethan's work alibi, and dig into the Clark family's past. But already, the question was forming in her mind, growing louder with each step she took away from that old colonial house. Who was Ethan Clark, really? Detective Laura Mitchell was no stranger to difficult cases, but something about this one felt different. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan Clark's calm, unflinching face as he described his last moments with his mother. She had seen grief in many forms: shock, anger, disbelief. But Ethan? He was as unmoved as a stone. She returned to the station that evening, her mind already crafting the questions she would need to ask. By the time she had everything ready, she received word that Greg Clark had brought Ethan in for questioning. Laura took a deep breath, reminding herself to approach the case objectively, even as her instincts were beginning to turn. In the interrogation room, Ethan sat alone, his shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the table in front of him. When Laura entered, he looked up briefly, his expression neutral. She offered a polite nod as she settled across from him, placing a recorder between them. "Ethan," she began, her voice soft but steady, "thank you for coming in today. I know this is a difficult time." He gave a slight nod, his face impassive. "It's okay. I want to help." "I'm glad to hear that," Laura replied, her gaze intent on his. "We're just trying to get a clearer picture of what happened, to understand the events leading up to your mother's death." Ethan's eyes flickered down to the table, but he said nothing. "Now, you said you were with her in the morning, helping her bring in groceries. Could you walk me through your day from the time you got up?" Laura asked, her pen poised over her notebook. Ethan took a deep breath, as if gathering his thoughts. "I got up around 9. Mom was already out grocery shopping. I made breakfast, checked my phone. Nothing special. When she got back, I helped her carry the bags in from the car." "What happened after that?" "She sat in the living room with a book. I think it was something by Agatha Christie," he said, his voice carrying a faint hint of recognition, though it vanished as quickly as it had come. "She liked mysteries." "Did you talk much?" Laura pressed. He shook his head. "Not really. She was tired, I guess. She told me she might take a nap later. I left after that." "Where did you go?" "To Mrs. Bell's house. She wanted me to transplant some bushes for her and do a little yard work. She left me a list of things to do since she was out of town." "And did you speak with her before going over?" Laura asked, studying his reaction carefully. Ethan shifted in his seat, his fingers twisting together. "No, not really. I left her a voicemail, just letting her know I was taking care of things." Laura nodded, making a note. "How long were you there?" "Maybe an hour. I finished the work, called her again to check in, and then went to my job at Hardy's Hardware." Laura leaned forward slightly. "Do you often call Mrs. Bell to check in about your work?" Ethan's brow furrowed, a hint of confusion crossing his face. "Sometimes. I don't know. I figured it was polite. She pays me to take care of her yard. so I wanted her to know it was done. There was a subtle tightening in his voice, as if he sensed her skepticism. Laura gave him a small, encouraging smile. And when you got to Hardy's Hardware, did you check in with anyone there? She asked. Yeah, I punched in. My shift started at 3, but I got there a few minutes early. I went straight to the back to start unloading some new inventory. What kind of inventory? Ethan paused, frowning slightly as he tried to remember. It was mostly wood pallets, and there was some yard equipment too. They had us clear space for a new shipment, so I was moving a lot of things around. Laura's eyes drifted to his hands, resting on the table. The cuts were fresh, dark against his pale skin. Did you get hurt while you were working? Ethan glanced down at his hands, his mouth tightening. Yeah, I was flipping over a pallet, and my hand got caught. Tore the skin a bit. He shrugged, as if it were nothing, but Laura could see a faint tremor in his hands as he flexed them. May I see? She asked, gesturing to his injured hand. He hesitated, then extended his right hand across the table. She observed the cuts, the rough edges of skin that looked more like raw abrasions than splinters. Looks painful, she said lightly. It stings, but it's not too bad, he replied, retracting his hand quickly. Your coworkers mentioned these kinds of injuries are rare in your line of work, Laura remarked, her voice gentle but pointed. Ethan's expression tightened, and he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Well, I guess I was just unlucky. There was a long silence between them, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Ethan, Laura began slowly, do you and your mother have a good relationship? He glanced at her, his face clouded. We get along mostly. It's been hard, with her illness. Can you tell me more about that? Ethan's eyes drifted to the floor, his voice lowering. She's been on medication for a while now. When she takes it, she's okay. Calm, even. But when she stops, it's like a switch flips. She gets angry, impulsive. There was a time last year. She tried to choke me. She was in one of her manic states. Laura felt a pang of sympathy. That must have been very difficult for you. He shrugged again, the gesture small and almost dismissive. It was a long time ago. She got help after that, and things were better. And how were things leading up to her death? Any tension between you? No, he said, his tone flat. Not really. She was doing okay, taking her medication. Laura tilted her head, studying him. You sound detached. It's unusual for someone in your situation. His gaze flicked back to her, a flash of irritation in his eyes. Everyone grieves differently, detective. It doesn't mean I didn't care about her. Laura's pen paused mid-note. She didn't break eye contact. Of course. But it's natural to feel something, Ethan. Shock, anger, sadness, something. Ethan looked away, a muscle tightening in his jaw. Maybe I'm still processing it. She let his response hang in the air, her intuition urging her to dig deeper. One last question for now, Ethan. Do you know of anyone who would want to hurt your mother? Ethan shook his head immediately. No. She was quiet. She didn't have friends, really, but she didn't have enemies either. Laura leaned back, considering his answers, her eyes still on him. I appreciate your cooperation, Ethan. We're just trying to understand the truth. As he stood to leave, Laura's mind raced. Ethan's calm demeanor, the inconsistencies, the injuries on his hands. It was all beginning to feel too orchestrated. And yet, she couldn't shake the small, nagging doubt that perhaps Ethan wasn't giving her the whole story. She watched him walk out of the room, his shoulders rigid, his gaze fixed straight ahead. But before the door closed, she caught one last look at his eyes. They held something, anger, perhaps, or maybe a grief too twisted to be easily recognized. Either way, it was enough to leave Laura feeling that this case was far from straightforward. Detective Laura Mitchell spent the following morning reviewing every detail of the Clark family's file. The facts were stark but plain. Linda Clark, 49, was found dead in her backyard shed, showing clear signs of blunt force trauma. Her husband, Greg Clark, was cleared of suspicion due to a rock-solid alibi. But her son, Ethan, was proving to be a complex enigma. Laura leaned back in her chair, her fingers tapping the desk as she replayed Ethan's interview in her mind. He hadn't reacted like most people faced with such tragic news, and his story was filled with evasions. But was it shock, guilt, or simply a coping mechanism? Her thoughts were interrupted when she heard a knock at her door. It was her partner, Detective Paul Sanders, a veteran of the Willowbrook force who knew the townspeople and history better than anyone. "Morning, Laura," Paul greeted, settling into the chair across from her. "Anything new on the Clark case?" Laura nodded, showing him her notes. "We need to dive deeper into the family's history." Ethan hinted at a lot of turmoil but was hesitant to give details. "I want to understand what it was really like in that house." Paul scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I've heard talk over the years, nothing concrete, just whispers. Linda had a reputation for being, well, unpredictable. The bipolar disorder, I'd imagine." "Yes, but there's more." Ethan mentioned an incident where Linda attacked him during a manic episode. "I want to see if there's any record of it," Laura replied, her voice steady but intrigued. "All right, let's see what we can dig up." Later that afternoon, Laura drove to the Clark house, a modest colonial set back from the road with a sprawling yard now untended and overgrown. The wind had picked up, rustling through the leaves, casting a somber tone over the property. Clara Clark, Ethan's younger sister, was the one who answered the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and red from crying, but she offered Laura a polite, tentative smile. "Hi, Detective. My dad's not here, but I can help if you need anything," Clara said, her voice soft, almost timid. Laura gave her a reassuring smile. "Thank you, Clara. I just have a few questions about your family, about your mom, mostly." Clara led her into the living room, where Laura noticed the Clark family portraits lining the walls, each showing a progressively older Ethan and Clara, both children smiling with a mother who looked vibrant and whole. It was a stark contrast to the shadows Laura was uncovering. "What was it like with your mom?" Laura asked gently, sitting across from Clara. Clara's face tightened, her gaze dropping to her hands. "Mom, she was complicated. Most of the time, she was wonderful, funny, smart, kind. But then, there were other times." Laura waited patiently, giving Clara the space to continue. "When she was off her meds, she would become someone else. She'd get angry," Clara whispered, almost as if she were afraid of the words. "It's hard to explain. She'd lash out, say things she didn't mean, and sometimes she'd even get physical. It was like a storm inside her, and we'd all feel it." Laura nodded. "Did you ever feel unsafe around her?" Clara hesitated, her eyes misting over as she recalled a memory. "I guess I did once. But Ethan, he took the brunt of it. He was older, and she expected a lot from him. When she was in one of her moods, he'd try to calm her down. But sometimes it just made things worse." "Did something happen between them recently?" Laura asked, noting the way Clara's shoulders tensed at the question. Clara glanced toward the closed door, then looked back at Laura. "Not recently. Things had actually been okay the past few months. Mom was taking her medication. But there was one time, maybe a year ago." She paused, her voice catching. "She had an episode one night. I woke up to screaming and ran to their bedroom. Mom was yelling at Dad, accusing him of things, saying he was ruining her life. And then Ethan came in, trying to calm her down, but she turned on him instead." Laura's heart panged with a sense of dread. "What did she do?" Clara's voice dropped, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. "She lunged at him. She grabbed him by the throat, clawing at his face. I tried to pull her off, but she was too strong, like she didn't even know who we were. Finally, Dad managed to pull her away, and that's when we decided she needed help. Ethan never said much about it, but I could tell he was shaken." "Did Ethan ever talk to you about how he felt toward her?" Clara shook her head, biting her lip. "No. He would just say, 'Mom's not well, and that's okay. She'll get better.' But after that night, I think something in him changed." Laura noted the flicker of emotion in Clara's eyes, something between sorrow and fear. After leaving the Clark residence, Laura headed straight to the records department to look up the incident Clara described. Sure enough, she found a report filed by Greg Clark from the previous year. The details were concise but unmistakable. Linda had been in a manic state, and the altercation with Ethan had become violent enough that they'd considered taking legal action to have her committed. However, the family ultimately chose not to pursue it, opting instead to help Linda privately. Laura sat back, digesting the report. Ethan's calm exterior now made a little more sense. He had endured his mother's outbursts for years, and perhaps he'd grown numb to it all. But it still didn't explain his reaction, or lack of one, to her death. She looked at her watch, realizing it was time to visit Mrs. Bell, the elderly neighbor Ethan had supposedly been helping the day of Linda's death. Laura hoped the neighbor could provide a clear timeline for Ethan's whereabouts that morning. Mrs. Bell's house was a quaint, white-painted cottage with a wraparound porch filled with potted plants and wind chimes. Laura knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open to reveal a frail but spry woman in her 70s, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp. "Detective Mitchell?" she asked, her voice soft but direct. "Yes, Mrs. Bell. Thank you for speaking with me. I understand that Ethan Clark helps you with yard work?" Mrs. Bell nodded, gesturing for Laura to sit with her on the porch. "Ethan's a good boy. He's been helping me with my garden since last summer. Always polite and reliable. Was he here the morning his mother died?" Mrs. Bell frowned, her expression thoughtful. "He was, but I wasn't. I went to visit my sister that week. He left me a message, said he was taking care of the lilacs I asked him to transplant." Laura leaned in. "Did you ask him to call and check in on his progress?" Mrs. Bell shook her head, a bit surprised by the question. "No, I trust him completely. He usually just comes when he can and leaves a note or sends me a text if he needs anything." "So, the call was unusual?" She nodded slowly, her face wrinkling with confusion. "Yes, I suppose it was. He'd never done that before. Is something wrong, Detective?" Laura gave a polite but non-committal smile. "Just routine questions, Mrs. Bell. I appreciate your help." As she walked back to her car, Laura's mind was buzzing. The phone calls to Mrs. Bell were starting to look less like simple courtesy and more like attempts to establish an alibi. Ethan was a reserved young man, and his behavior was only growing more curious as the investigation continued. The image of his calm, neutral face during questioning replayed in her mind, and a chill ran through her. Back at the station, she found Paul reviewing the files. He looked up as she entered, raising an eyebrow. "Any new insights?" Laura sank into her chair, rubbing her temples. Ethan might have a carefully crafted alibi that's starting to look shaky. He made calls to Mrs. Bell, supposedly to update her on his work, but she said he never usually does that. Paul leaned back, considering this. Could be trying to cover his tracks, but it's not enough on its own. "No," Laura agreed, "but there's something else. The family has a history of violence from Linda toward Ethan. He may have felt a mixture of love and resentment that's hard to unpack. Clara said he tried to shield her, but it took a toll." Paul nodded slowly, a grim expression on his face. "So we're left wondering, did he finally snap? Or is he just hardened by years of coping with her illness?" Laura added quietly. They both fell silent, the weight of uncertainty hanging over them. Laura knew she was on the verge of something, but the pieces were still scattered, the edges rough and unfit. One thing was certain. This case was quickly becoming one of the most puzzling in her career. She stood, determination settling over her like a mantle. She needed to find out whether Ethan's silence hid guilt, or if he was simply a young man haunted by too many years of holding a fractured family together. Detective Laura Mitchell tapped her pen thoughtfully as she reviewed her notes, the picture of Ethan Clark growing more ambiguous with each passing day. Every fact seemed to produce more questions rather than answers, and she felt herself diving into a labyrinth with no clear exit. Ethan's calm exterior, his curious alibi, and his complex relationship with his mother all left her wondering. Was he guilty, or just another victim of a family torn apart by mental illness? With this unease gnawing at her, Laura decided it was time to check his alibi more thoroughly. Hardy's Hardware was a small, locally owned store that had served Willowbrook for decades, and Ethan had been working there since graduating high school. She hoped the store would have some form of timekeeping records to help her piece together his movements on the day of Linda's death. The smell of wood and fresh paint greeted Laura as she stepped into the hardware store. Jim Hardy, the owner, was stocking shelves behind the counter when she approached. He was a tall man with a thick, graying beard and an easy smile that faltered slightly when Laura introduced herself. "Detective Mitchell, I've got a few questions about Ethan Clark," she said, trying to keep her tone neutral but direct. Jim nodded, his expression growing somber. "I heard about what happened to Linda. Terrible business. Ethan's a good kid, though, always on time. Does his work without complaint. Can't say a bad word about him." Laura nodded, glancing around the store. "Do you have records of when he punched in that day? Any logs that could confirm when he arrived?" Jim scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Well, we're a small place, so it's just an old-fashioned punch clock. Ethan usually punches in 10 or 15 minutes early, just like he did that day. But we don't track breaks or movements in the store." "Do you recall seeing him when he arrived?" Jim nodded. "I did. Actually, he walked in right on time, like usual. He started unloading pallets, then went to check on the yard equipment we got in. He seemed distracted, but I figured it was nothing." "Distracted how?" Laura pressed. Jim paused, choosing his words carefully. "I asked him about a new shipment we got in, and he barely seemed to hear me. Kept looking at his hands, like he'd hurt them." Laura's attention sharpened. "Did he say how he injured them?" "Said it was from handling the pallets. It looked bad enough that I offered him a bandage, but he shrugged it off." Jim hesitated, glancing at her with a concerned frown. "Detective, do you think he was involved in his mother's death?" Laura gave him a tight-lipped smile. "We're just following every lead, Jim. I appreciate your help." As she left the store, Laura felt an unsettled sensation twisting in her gut. Ethan had been at work that day, but his behavior seemed odd, as if he were preoccupied with something heavier than a splintered pallet. And with no precise log of his movements, there were still gaps in his alibi, enough for doubt to linger. Back at the station, Laura met with Detective Paul Sanders, who had been reviewing Ethan's phone records, hoping they might provide some clarity. "Laura, you're going to want to see this," Paul said, his face set in a grim expression. He handed her a printout of Ethan's recent calls. Laura's eyes widened as she scanned the list. "There are multiple calls to Mrs. Bell on the morning of Linda's death. Far more than just a quick check-in." Paul nodded. "Exactly. He called her 3 times before noon, all within about an hour. Why would he be so insistent about reaching her if he knew she was out of town?" "Unless he was establishing an alibi," Laura said, her voice laced with growing suspicion. "And it gets better," Paul added, flipping to another sheet. "I called Mrs. Bell's phone provider and confirmed the exact times. Ethan left her a voicemail each time, which means he knew he wouldn't reach her live." Laura felt a chill spread through her. It's as if he wanted proof he was there, even if no one could confirm it. They exchanged a look, both aware of the implications. Laura felt a pang of frustration. She had no hard evidence, only a web of circumstantial signs, suspicions, and Ethan's strange behavior. "Paul, I think it's time we bring him in for another round of questioning. There's something he's not telling us." That afternoon, Ethan sat across from Laura once more, his face just as blank as before, his gaze fixed and unyielding. Laura took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Ethan, we need to talk about your calls to Mrs. Bell. You called her 3 times that morning, left multiple voicemails, and yet she was out of town." Ethan shifted slightly, his hands tensing in his lap. "I just wanted her to know I was keeping up with the work. I thought it was the right thing to do." Laura leaned forward, her tone soft but probing. 3 calls in less than an hour? That's a lot for just a check-in, don't you think? Ethan's eyes flickered, a spark of something unspoken crossing his face before he quickly masked it. "I was trying to be responsible." Laura wasn't convinced. "Ethan, is there anything you're not telling us? This is your chance to be completely honest. If there's any detail you're holding back, now is the time to share it." Silence hung heavy in the room as Ethan's gaze dropped to the table. For a moment, Laura thought he might open up, that she might see some crack in the armor he wore. But instead, he looked up, his face impassive. "I've told you everything," he said, his tone even, almost robotic. "I have nothing more to say." Laura took a steadying breath, shifting tactics. "Let's talk about your relationship with your mother, then. I understand it was complicated. Ethan's jaw tightened, and a flicker of irritation passed over his face. She was my mom. I took care of her. What else do you want me to say? Laura pressed gently. Sometimes caring for someone can be incredibly hard, especially when they're unwell. Did you ever feel overwhelmed? Ethan hesitated, his hands clenching in his lap. I did what I could. She wasn't easy to live with, but she was my mother. Laura noticed the way his gaze flicked to his hands again, his fingers tracing over the cuts. Your hands, they look painful. He glanced down, shrugging. I told you. It happened at work. Laura's voice was steady as she asked, Ethan, is that the real story? He didn't answer, his gaze fixed downward, his silence more telling than words. Laura waited, watching him closely, but he simply clenched his hands and remained still. Ethan, she said gently, if there's anything else you need to share, now's the time. It can be hard to carry something like this on your own. He finally looked up, his eyes filled with a quiet, almost weary defiance. I'm not carrying anything. I didn't do anything. Laura sighed, sensing the walls he'd built around himself were too thick, too high to break down in one sitting. But there was one last question she wanted to ask, one she had held back until now. Ethan, do you know how your mother died? He blinked, caught off guard by the question, but quickly regained his composure. I thought she just hurt herself somehow. Laura leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan, your mother didn't die by accident. She was killed. Someone murdered her. A flicker of something crossed his face. Shock, perhaps, or something darker, more internal. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, replaced by that same blank mask. He looked away, his face expressionless. I don't know anything about that, he replied, his voice quiet, almost hollow. Laura watched him, searching for some sign of genuine emotion, some indication that he felt even a sliver of grief or fear. But there was nothing. Thank you for your time, Ethan, she said finally, her tone cool. That will be all for now. He nodded, standing slowly and heading for the door without another word. As she watched him leave, a sense of frustration and unease settled over Laura. Ethan's calm demeanor, his evasive answers, his odd attempts to construct an alibi, they all pointed to something being deeply, dangerously wrong. She knew that uncovering the truth would be difficult, that every question only seemed to breed more uncertainty. But as she sat alone in the interrogation room, Laura resolved that she wouldn't stop until she found out whether Ethan Clark was an innocent son mourning his mother, or the man who'd killed her. Detective Laura Mitchell's instincts were rarely wrong, but this case was testing her resolve. Ethan Clark had given her every reason to be suspicious. His mechanical demeanor, his puzzling attempts to build an alibi, and the ever-present shadows of his troubled family history. And yet, there was no concrete evidence tying him directly to his mother's murder, only vague inconsistencies and hints of something dark that he kept buried. As the autumn sun began to set behind the station's windows, casting long shadows across her desk, Laura prepared herself for another round with Ethan. She knew she needed to break through his calm exterior to find the truth, but she also knew that pressing him too hard could risk pushing him deeper into silence. That evening, she called in Ethan for what she hoped would be the final, definitive conversation. As he walked into the room, his face was as expressionless as ever, his eyes distant. He looked more like someone caught in a storm of apathy than a grieving son. Thank you for coming back, Ethan, Laura began, settling across from him. She wanted to make this as open as possible, to create space for him to reveal even the slightest detail he might be holding back. Ethan gave her a slight nod, his posture rigid as he folded his hands on the table. I just want to get this over with. Laura noticed his voice was hollow, his tone almost detached, as if he were talking about someone else's life instead of his own. She leaned forward, maintaining steady eye contact. Ethan, I know you want this to be over, but we need clarity. I need you to help me understand what you're feeling. He shrugged, glancing down at his hands. There's nothing to understand. My mother's gone, and I'm processing it. Laura pressed gently. Processing it how? Have you cried, gotten angry, or even talked to anyone about what you're going through? Ethan's face remained impassive. Everyone keeps asking me how I feel. I don't know how I'm supposed to feel. My mother wasn't exactly easy to live with. Laura sensed a flicker of honesty in his words, a glimpse of the weight he carried. Ethan, we all know your mother struggled, but that doesn't mean you didn't care about her. It's okay to have complicated feelings. Grief isn't always straightforward. Ethan's jaw tightened, and his eyes grew dark. I'm tired of everyone acting like I should be falling apart. I handled her moods, her outbursts, her paranoia, for years. I did what I had to do because she was my mother, and there was no one else who could. Laura paused, letting his words hang in the air. There was something raw in his voice, a faint crack in his otherwise calm facade. She seized the opportunity. Tell me more about what it was like, Ethan. How did her illness affect you? He looked away, a storm of conflicting emotions flitting across his face. It was exhausting. One day she'd be herself, funny, even, and the next, she was someone else entirely. Sometimes she'd lash out at me or Dad, say horrible things. It's hard to know how to mourn someone when they've hurt you so many times. Laura nodded, choosing her next words carefully. So, do you feel relieved now that she's gone? Ethan's gaze shot back to her, his eyes flashing with something that looked almost like anger. I didn't say that. I didn't say you did, Ethan, Laura replied calmly. But you've been through a lot. Anyone in your shoes would feel complicated, maybe even resentful. He looked down, his hands tightening into fists. I did resent her sometimes, but that doesn't mean I wanted her dead. Maybe not, Laura allowed. But after so many years of being the one to handle everything, it would be natural if you felt like a weight had been lifted, like you could finally breathe. Ethan didn't respond, his silence speaking louder than words. He looked trapped, as if he were standing at the edge of something he couldn't quite face. After a long pause, Laura decided to confront him with the truth he'd been trying to avoid. Ethan, your mother was murdered. Someone hurt her deliberately. I can't ignore the signs that you might know more than you're letting on. Please, if you're holding anything back, anything at all, now is the time to tell me. For a brief moment, Ethan's mask faltered. His eyes filled with something Laura couldn't quite read. Was it guilt, fear, or perhaps both? He looked away, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I didn't want this. I just wanted things to be normal. What do you mean by normal? Laura asked, leaning in. He exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. I wanted her to get better. I wanted a mother who wasn't constantly breaking down or turning into someone I couldn't recognize. I wanted her to just be okay. Is that so wrong? Laura's heart softened, realizing she was finally glimpsing the real Ethan. The boy who had shouldered more than he should have, who had been left to navigate his mother's turbulent world with little guidance. It's not wrong, Ethan, she said quietly, but I need you to tell me what happened that day. Walk me through it. What did you feel when you left her that morning? He looked at her, his eyes blank but his voice quivering. I felt guilty. Guilty that I was relieved to be away from her. It was the first morning in a long time where she seemed calm, almost happy. I thought maybe we'd have a good day, but I just wanted to escape. Where did you go after you left? Laura pressed, her tone soft but insistent. To Mrs. Bell's, he replied, his voice barely a whisper. I went there and tried to distract myself. I kept thinking about how much easier it would be if I didn't have to come home and worry about her. But I swear I didn't do anything to hurt her. I just wanted a break. Laura let his words sink in, the weight of his confession heavy between them. She felt the fragility of his mental state, the fractures that years of responsibility had left in him. But she needed more. Ethan, you left Mrs. Bell's and then went to work, right? Did you go anywhere else? Did you see anyone else? He looked down, his fingers twitching. No, I went to work. That was it. Laura watched him closely, noting the strain in his posture, the way his words seemed rehearsed yet hollow. It was as if he were trying to convince himself as much as her. She leaned back, letting silence fill the room before she spoke again. Ethan, I need you to understand something, Laura said quietly. The way you're reacting, the things you're holding back, they're only making things look worse for you. I want to believe you, but I need honesty. His gaze dropped, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of fear in his eyes. He looked almost haunted, as if he were carrying a secret too heavy to bear alone. I didn't hurt her, detective, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I wanted to get away, yes, but I didn't do this. Laura stared at him, searching for any sign of deception, any indication that he was lying. But all she saw was a young man burdened by a weight he didn't know how to carry, a son torn between love and resentment, guilt and grief. Thank you, Ethan, she said finally, nodding toward the door. That will be all for today. Ethan rose slowly, his shoulders slumped, and walked out without looking back. Laura watched him go, her mind racing with questions and doubts. She felt as though she were standing on the edge of a truth she couldn't yet grasp, a truth tangled in Ethan's silence, his guilt, and his conflicting emotions. As she sat alone in the empty room, Detective Laura Mitchell replayed every word of their conversation in her mind. Ethan's detachment, his eerie calm, his veiled resentment toward his mother. None of it was proof of guilt, but it all hinted at a deeper story, one that Ethan either couldn't or wouldn't reveal. But as the door closed behind him, Laura knew that, guilty or not, Ethan Clark was hiding something. And until she could break through that final wall of silence, she would be left haunted by a case that refused to give up its secrets. For now, she was left with only one undeniable fact. Someone had murdered Linda Clark, and the answer to who and why lay somewhere in the shadows of Ethan's fractured heart. The day Ethan Clark's trial began, Willowbrook buzzed with tension. The small-town courthouse, normally quiet and nearly empty, was packed with curious residents, press, and family friends, all eager to witness the unfolding drama. For months, rumors had swept through the community, each person adding their own spin on the tragic story of the Clark family. Some believed Ethan to be an innocent young man unfairly scrutinized. Others whispered that he was hiding something sinister. Detective Laura Mitchell sat in the back row, her heart heavy with conflicting emotions. She'd spent countless hours piecing together the fragments of the case, but as the trial loomed before her, she was left with the uncomfortable feeling that not all the pieces fit. And yet, there was enough circumstantial evidence to make her question Ethan's innocence. The prosecution began its opening statement with a quiet, almost solemn intensity. District Attorney Michael Gaines, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for his unrelenting pursuit of justice, took his place at the podium. He cast a serious gaze over the jury, his voice low but unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case of a son's resentment gone too far, a son pushed to his breaking point by years of pent-up anger and frustration. Linda Clark was a woman plagued by mental illness, but she was a mother who loved her children. And on a cold morning in autumn, her life was taken in a violent act of rage. He glanced at Ethan, who sat stiffly, his face impassive, eyes staring straight ahead. Ethan Clark stands accused of murdering his mother in cold blood. The evidence may be circumstantial, but it points in one direction. A son who wanted to escape his mother's struggles, who finally saw a way to be free of her burden. We will show that Ethan's lack of emotion, his attempts to fabricate an alibi, and his strange, detached behavior are signs of guilt. The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting uneasy glances at Ethan, who remained unmoved, as if the words being spoken were about someone else. When it was time for the defense to speak, Ethan's lawyer, Rachel Sutherland, approached the jury with a calm, reassuring smile. Rachel was known for her empathy and skillful arguments, and her expression was filled with quiet confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her voice gentle but firm. This case is about more than just facts. It's about understanding a family in pain. Linda Clark was a woman who struggled deeply with mental health issues, and her illness affected everyone around her, especially her son, Ethan. She gestured to Ethan, who looked small and almost fragile in his seat, his face pale under the harsh courtroom lights. Ethan is not a monster, and he is not a murderer. He is a young man who bore the weight of caring for his mother, who sacrificed his own peace to support her through the darkest moments of her life. There is no physical evidence connecting Ethan to the crime. No DNA, no fingerprints, no murder weapon. The prosecution's case is based on assumptions about his demeanor and his behavior, but assumptions are not facts. Rachel paused, letting her words settle over the courtroom. We urge you to look beyond surface appearances, beyond the sorrow and pain, and see the truth. Ethan Clark did not kill his mother. He is an innocent man caught in a tragedy. With her closing words, Rachel returned to her seat, casting a reassuring glance at Ethan, who met her gaze with a flicker of gratitude. The trial continued over the next several days, each side presenting their case with increasing intensity. The prosecution relied heavily on witness testimonies, circumstantial evidence, and character analysis, while the defense focused on dismantling each point, questioning the validity of assumptions based on Ethan's reserved demeanor. Detective Paul Sanders was the prosecution's first key witness, his experience and insights lending weight to their case. Paul described the initial investigation, outlining the oddities in Ethan's behavior and the suspicious details of his alibi. Detective Sanders, the DA asked, "Can you describe Ethan's reaction when he was told his mother had been murdered?" Paul nodded gravely. He showed no emotion, no surprise, no sorrow. In my years of experience, that kind of response is rare, especially in cases where a close family member has been killed. Rachel, quick to rebut, approached Paul during cross-examination. Detective Sanders, is it true that people react to grief and trauma in different ways? Yes, Paul admitted, a slight hesitation in his voice. And in this case, Ethan Clark had spent years dealing with his mother's mental illness, hadn't he? Isn't it possible that his response was due to emotional exhaustion rather than guilt? Paul paused, choosing his words carefully. It's possible, but his reaction was unsettling, to say the least. Next, the prosecution brought in a recording of the voicemails Ethan had left on Mrs. Bell's phone the morning of the murder. The jury listened intently, their expressions tense as they heard Ethan's calm, measured voice echo through the courtroom, each message a cold reminder of his unusual behavior. "Hey, Mrs. Bell, it's Ethan. Just wanted to let you know I'm taking care of the yard work. Hope you're doing well." Rachel objected to the interpretation of the messages, arguing that Ethan's voicemails could just as easily be seen as an attempt to maintain professionalism. But the prosecution insisted that his efforts were a deliberate attempt to create a false alibi. In cross-examination, Rachel challenged the prosecution's interpretation. "Ethan had worked for Mrs. Bell for months," she reminded the jury. "He often left her messages about his work. Is it really so unusual that he'd call her to let her know he was taking care of things while she was away?" The jury shifted in their seats, some nodding slightly. It was a valid point, and Laura, watching from the back, felt her own doubts resurface. Rachel's defense was solid, but something about Ethan's actions still didn't sit right with her. The most anticipated testimony came from Clara Clark, Ethan's younger sister. She approached the stand with visible unease, her eyes darting nervously around the courtroom before finally settling on her brother. Clara's hands shook as she was sworn in, and her voice was barely a whisper as she began. "Clara, can you tell us about your relationship with your mother?" Rachel asked, her tone gentle. Clara took a deep breath. "It was complicated. Mom was sick. Some days she was amazing, fun, caring. Other days, it was like she was someone else. It was hard to predict what she'd be like." Rachel nodded, her expression sympathetic. "And how did Ethan handle those days?" Clara's eyes filled with tears as she looked at her brother. "Ethan was patient. He always tried to help her, even when it meant sacrificing his own happiness. He loved her. I know he did." The DA stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "Clara, did Ethan ever express frustration with your mother? Did he ever say he wished he didn't have to deal with her?" Clara hesitated, visibly torn. He said it was hard, but he never meant anything by it. He was just tired." The DA pressed harder. "Would you say he resented her?" Clara's voice shook. "Maybe sometimes, but that doesn't mean he would hurt her." The prosecution's questioning left the jury uneasy, and as Clara stepped down, a heavy silence fell over the courtroom. The final day of the trial was intense, with both sides delivering impassioned closing statements. The prosecution reminded the jury of Ethan's cold demeanor, his alibi that felt too carefully constructed, and his history of frustration with his mother's illness. "This is not just a story about a young man who felt overwhelmed," the DA said firmly. This is a story of resentment turned to rage. The evidence may be circumstantial, but it paints a picture that cannot be ignored. Ethan Clark had the motive and the opportunity, and his behavior shows his guilt. Rachel, in her final statement, urged the jury to look beyond suspicion and focus on the lack of physical evidence. There is no murder weapon, no DNA, no witness. Ethan Clark is a young man who has already endured more pain than most of us can imagine. He's not a monster. He's a son caught in a tragedy. To convict him based solely on behavior would be an injustice. The jury was left with a difficult decision, and as they filed out of the courtroom to deliberate, the weight of uncertainty hung over everyone. Laura felt her heart race as she watched them leave, torn between her professional instincts and her personal doubts. Hours passed, each moment heavier than the last, until finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the foreperson stood, her face unreadable. We, the jury, find the defendant, Ethan Clark, guilty of second-degree murder. A collective gasp filled the room. Ethan's face remained impassive, but a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. Rachel placed a hand on his shoulder, murmuring reassurances, but he didn't respond. Laura felt a chill run down her spine, the uneasy feeling that the truth had slipped just beyond her grasp. As the judge sentenced Ethan to 20 to 60 years in prison, Laura left the courtroom with a hollow sense of closure. The evidence had painted Ethan as a troubled son driven to desperation, but something in her heart whispered that there was more to the story. Was he truly guilty, or had they all been misled by the shadows of a family's pain? The question lingered as Laura walked out into the cold autumn air, leaving the case behind but carrying the haunting feeling that the truth was still out there, hidden beneath layers of grief, guilt, and secrets that may never fully come to light. The conviction of Ethan Clark had sent ripples through Willowbrook. Opinions were sharply divided. Some believed justice had been served, while others whispered doubts, questioning whether an innocent young man was paying the price for a crime he didn't commit. Detective Laura Mitchell was among those who couldn't shake the feeling that something vital had been missed. The evidence had felt incomplete, leaving her with a gnawing sense of unease that refused to dissipate. Days after the trial, Laura sat in her office, reviewing the case file for the 100th time. Every detail was burned into her mind, yet the answers continued to elude her. She thought about Ethan's calm demeanor, his confusing alibi, and the layers of family pain he had carried for years. And then there was Clara, his younger sister, who had looked so desperate on the witness stand, pleading in her own quiet way for the jury to see her brother's humanity. Laura's thoughts were interrupted by a knock on her door. She looked up to find Rachel Sutherland, Ethan's lawyer, standing there with a grim expression. "Detective Mitchell, may I have a moment?" Rachel asked, her voice low. "Of course, Rachel," Laura replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I've been meaning to reach out to you. There are aspects of this case I can't let go of." Rachel nodded, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. "I feel the same way. I'm here because I've just received a motion from the prosecution. They've requested a new charge of second-degree murder be added as an option to Ethan's sentencing." Laura's brow furrowed in confusion. "Why now? The jury has already rendered its verdict." Rachel sighed, running a hand through her hair. "That's what I'm trying to figure out. It's as if they're hedging their bets. They want the option for second-degree murder, which could imply they're no longer confident they can uphold a conviction of first-degree murder on appeal." Laura's mind raced as she absorbed this unexpected twist. The prosecution's strategy was unusual, to say the least, and it only deepened her suspicion that there was more to this case than met the eye. "What are your thoughts, Rachel?" Laura asked carefully. Rachel looked her in the eye, her voice firm. "I believe Ethan is innocent. But even if he's not, the prosecution's evidence was thin. This new motion feels like an admission of doubt on their part. If they're not confident, why should the rest of us be?" Laura's mind was now a whirlwind of possibilities. She had seen Ethan's conviction, watched as he was led out of the courtroom, his expression stoic yet shattered. If there was even the slightest chance they had convicted the wrong person, she needed to act. "Rachel," she said slowly, "I'm going to take another look at the case. There might be something we missed, some piece of evidence overlooked." Rachel's eyes lit with cautious hope. "If there's anything I can do to help, Detective, please let me know. Ethan's life is at stake here. Over the next several days, Laura worked tirelessly, poring over every detail, interviewing anyone remotely connected to the case. She combed through the evidence, the testimonies, even the autopsy report, searching for the missing piece that might explain the inconsistencies gnawing at her. Then, late one evening, she uncovered something that stopped her cold. Reviewing the police photographs taken at the scene, she noticed a detail she had previously overlooked: a faint footprint in the mud outside the Clark's shed. It wasn't large enough to be Ethan's, nor was it Greg's. It looked like the footprint of someone smaller, perhaps a teenager or a young woman. Her pulse quickened. Could it be that Clara had been there that day? The next morning, Laura visited Clara at her aunt's house, where she had been staying since the trial. Clara opened the door, looking surprised but resigned, as if she had been expecting this moment. "Detective Mitchell," she said quietly, stepping aside to let Laura in. "What brings you here?" Laura took a deep breath, studying Clara carefully. "Clara, I need you to be honest with me. There are some questions I have about the day your mother died, and I need you to answer truthfully." Clara's face paled, and she cast her eyes downward. I don't know what you mean." Laura took a step closer, her voice gentle. "Clara, I know this is hard, but I found a footprint outside the shed, one that doesn't match Ethan or your father. It looks like it could be yours. Were you there that day?" Clara's shoulders slumped, and her hands began to shake. She glanced at Laura, her eyes filling with tears. I didn't mean to lie. I couldn't." Laura kept her voice calm, fighting to keep the shock from showing. "Clara, please tell me what happened. I need to know the truth." Clara's voice broke as she spoke. "I want to see Mom that morning. I'd overheard her arguing with Ethan the night before, and I wanted to make sure she was okay. But when I got there, she was angry. She was in one of her episodes, screaming, saying things I didn't understand." Laura nodded, her heart pounding. "What happened next?" Clara's face twisted with pain as she recalled the memory. "She started yelling at me, telling me I was just like Dad, that I was betraying her. I tried to calm her down, but she got violent. She grabbed me, and I panicked. I pushed her." Clara's confession hung heavily in the air, each word laced with raw agony. "She fell, and I saw blood," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt her. I just wanted to get away. I ran out of there, and I thought if I told anyone, they'd think I killed her." Laura reached out, placing a comforting hand on Clara's shoulder. "Clara, why didn't you tell the truth? Why let Ethan take the blame?" Clara buried her face in her hands, her voice muffled by tears. "Ethan found out what happened. I told him, and he said he'd protect me. He said he'd handle it, that he'd make sure no one blamed me. I begged him not to, but he wouldn't listen. He said it was better this way." Laura felt her heart sink as the full weight of Ethan's sacrifice became clear. He had taken the blame for his mother's death to protect his sister, knowing that the evidence was thin and that his own guilt would be questioned. He'd been willing to let his life fall apart to shield her from the pain he'd endured for so long. With Clara's confession in hand, Laura returned to the station, her mind racing. She knew she had to act quickly to prevent Ethan from serving a sentence for a crime he hadn't committed. She informed the DA's office of the new evidence and arranged for Clara's statement to be submitted to the court. In a rare, hastily arranged hearing, the judge reviewed the new evidence, and the defense filed a motion to overturn Ethan's conviction. The courtroom was nearly empty this time, a stark contrast to the trial's crowded chaos. But the tension was palpable as the judge considered the new evidence, his expression grave. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his voice echoing through the room. "Given this new evidence, it is clear that the circumstances of Linda Clark's death were a tragic accident, not a premeditated act of violence. Ethan Clark is hereby acquitted of all charges." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room as Rachel clasped Ethan's hand, her face alight with triumph. Ethan, though visibly shaken, managed a small, relieved smile, his eyes filling with emotion as he glanced back at Clara, who watched from the back of the room, her face tear-streaked and filled with guilt. As they left the courthouse, Laura approached Ethan, her heart heavy with both relief and sorrow. "I'm sorry it took so long, Ethan," she said softly. "You deserved better." Ethan shook his head, a faint, weary smile on his face. "You did your best. That's all anyone could ask for." Clara approached, her face filled with remorse. She looked at her brother, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Ethan, I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Ethan pulled her into a hug, his voice filled with quiet forgiveness. "It's okay, Clara. We're going to be okay." Laura watched them, her heart swelling with a mixture of relief and sadness. The truth had finally come to light, but the scars of this ordeal would linger. Still, as she watched the siblings walk away together, she felt a small sense of peace, knowing that perhaps they could begin to heal. The days after Ethan's acquittal were a strange, quiet blur. Willowbrook buzzed with the news, the townspeople exchanging stories, theories, and whispered apologies. Some had been quick to condemn Ethan, others had been skeptical, but now, with the truth revealed, the community found itself wrestling with a mixture of relief, guilt, and sympathy. In a town as small and tightly knit as Willowbrook, the Clark family's story had become everyone's story, a reminder of both the hidden struggles people carry and the lengths they go to protect each other. Detective Laura Mitchell watched the dust settle from a distance, feeling a sense of closure yet aware of the lingering questions and fractured lives the case had left behind. She had pursued justice relentlessly, and while she was relieved to see Ethan free, she couldn't help but feel haunted by the darkness this case had exposed. There were no real winners here, only survivors. For Ethan and Clara, freedom was both a relief and a burden. The months leading up to the trial, and the trial itself, had left scars that wouldn't soon fade. Clara, who had once idolized her brother, now looked at him with a mixture of awe and regret, feeling the weight of what he'd done for her. One afternoon, they sat together on the back porch of their childhood home, watching the autumn leaves drift to the ground. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of turning seasons, and for a moment, it felt like they were just two siblings enjoying a quiet afternoon. But the silence between them was heavy, filled with things left unsaid. "Ethan," Clara began, her voice barely a whisper, "I don't know how to thank you. You sacrificed so much. I don't think I can ever forgive myself for what I put you through." Ethan looked at her, a faint, forgiving smile on his face. "You don't have to thank me, Clara. We're family. I'd do it again if I had to." Clara's eyes filled with tears, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't deserve it, Ethan. I should have told the truth from the beginning. I was scared, but that's no excuse." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We all make mistakes, Clara. You were just a kid, caught in something too big to understand. I didn't want you to suffer for something that wasn't your fault. Mom's illness, it took a toll on all of us." They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun dip behind the trees, casting golden light across the yard where they'd once played as children. It was a bittersweet reminder of what they'd lost and what they still had. Later that week, Detective Mitchell visited Ethan at home, this time not as an investigator, but as someone who had become invested in his story and his future. She found him outside, helping Clara gather fallen branches and tidy up the yard, a task that seemed to carry more meaning now, as if they were clearing away the remnants of their shared pain. "Ethan," Laura greeted, her voice warm. He looked up, surprised but pleased to see her. "Detective Mitchell," he replied, giving a nod. "I wasn't expecting you." She smiled, gesturing for him to sit with her on a nearby bench. "I wanted to see how you were doing. I know that even with the case closed, it's not easy to move on." Ethan's gaze dropped to his hands, his fingers still bearing faint marks from his time in custody. "It feels strange. I spent so long thinking I'd lost everything. Now that it's over, I don't know what to do with myself." Laura nodded, understanding the feeling all too well. "It will take time, Ethan. What you went through, it changes a person, but you still have a chance to rebuild. You have your life ahead of you, and you've already shown more strength than most people ever will." Ethan looked up, a faint spark of determination in his eyes. "I don't know what the future holds, but I want to do something meaningful. Maybe something to help people who've been through things like this. I don't want anyone else to feel as alone as I did. Laura smiled, feeling a surge of pride for him. That's a brave goal, Ethan, and I think you'd be incredible at it. They sat quietly, watching Clara as she worked in the yard, her movements slow and thoughtful, as if each small task was part of her healing process. Laura felt a sense of peace knowing that, even with all the damage this case had caused, Ethan and Clara would find a way to move forward. As winter approached, Ethan began to work with a local organization that helped families affected by mental illness. He was quiet about his own experiences, only sharing parts of his story when it felt right. But his presence brought a calm reassurance to those he worked with, a sense that he understood their struggles in a way few others could. Clara, too, found a way to channel her grief into something constructive. She began volunteering at a nearby youth center, helping children who faced challenges at home, hoping that by supporting them, she could somehow atone for the pain she had caused her brother. Their paths were separate, yet intertwined, each finding purpose in helping others, healing the fractured parts of themselves piece by piece. Months later, Detective Laura Mitchell stood on the same courthouse steps where she'd watched Ethan's life nearly fall apart. She took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill her lungs, the weight of the case finally lifting from her shoulders. She thought about everything she'd learned, the strength of family bonds, the fragility of mental health, and the resilience of the human spirit. The Clark case had changed her, just as it had changed Ethan and Clara. It was a reminder of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most open and shut cases, of the shadows that hid in the corners of people's lives, influencing their choices, their fears, their regrets. But as she left the courthouse behind, Laura felt a quiet confidence that she'd done the right thing, that she had helped uncover the truth and bring justice to a family shattered by grief. And that, in itself, was a kind of peace. That evening, as Ethan and Clara sat together on their porch, watching the stars begin to emerge in the twilight sky, there was a sense of quiet hope between them. Their lives had been irrevocably changed, but they were still here, still together, still a family. Clara looked at her brother, her voice soft but certain. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Ethan smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "I think we already are, Clara. We've made it this far. We'll keep going." They sat in silence, two survivors bound by love and resilience, watching as the darkness gave way to stars, a reminder that even the longest nights could end with light.